Welcome back, AP. All right, great class today. I understand that y'all are getting really burnt out, you're getting really overloaded and stuff, but again, remember, the big things we're trying to remember about the scientific revolution, the Dutch Golden Age, the ideas behind the Hohenzollerns and things like that, we're looking now at a unit that has these big, broad themes. This is much more Renaissance-like and much less absolutist-like, right? We're not talking about, well, this guy liked these people, but then this guy didn't. We're not talking about a back and a forth, a push and a pull of power in Europe anymore. We're now talking about a major break and a change in ideological thought, right? We're now talking about a massive difference, okay? So, moving into that, we need to understand that Galileo's works on his dialogue on the two world systems, him angering the church, being called in front of the Inquisition, and his buddy Urban VIII kind of having to make an example out of him. And also, I didn't mention this in class, but he forced them to recant. So the priest that was in charge of the Inquisition was not actually the Pope. And to make a demonstration, he could not be in charge of the Inquisition that was putting trial on Galileo, because everybody knew that Galileo and the Pope were very close, right? And so a big thing is that the priest that puts him on trial tells him, recant, Galileo, take back the things that you have said, or else we will execute you and burn you at the stake. And so Galileo was forced to take back the things that he said, to take back the thoughts that were put down in his dialogue of the two chief world systems. But unfortunately, he is going to die under house arrest following this punishment, right? And in his studies, that's where he comes up with his ideas on everything being pulled down to earth in a parabola, right? Everything, objects falling at the same speed, all these different other ideas, actually discussing different movements of objects through space and also through the plane of Earth. He also kind of started to theorize the concept of inertia and a force that prevents an object from moving. And then Newton would actually eventually expand upon those things, right? So, getting to that, though, we are going to hopefully get to Newton today in this bad boy. But just so as we continue forward, you need to understand that... Wow, that was terrible. You need to understand that Galileo is causing a major break with the church, right? They're starting to break apart, okay? And also, like I said, his middle finger is just in a big glass tube and is like there for the entire world to see. But by 1616, following some of the major works of the Galileo going forward, De Rev, Copernicus's book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, that actually was the first to idealize, theorize, and actually put forward the idea of heliocentrism versus geocentrism, is going to be banned by the church, right? So what we're seeing now is this friction, this struggle between this quality of anti-science, anti-religion kind of stuff, right? But that didn't stop anybody. It didn't stop anybody by a long shot as well. And one of the big guys that's going to make even more waves forward is Sir Francis Bacon, who some people have theorized that he might be Shakespeare, which is terrible, because I don't know if you've ever seen New Atlantis, because I have, right? Like so. But trust me, Sir Francis Bacon is not as eloquent as Shakespeare, okay? Now, big thing, though, is because there's this conspiracy theory that a lot of people believe that Shakespeare actually didn't exist, right? Like, so that he actually wasn't a real person, that he was a collaborative effort of either Francis Bacon and other writers or other theatrical writers and, like, other people. Some people say that he was a woman, like, all this other stuff. But I digress, okay? So William Shakespeare would have been alive during the time of Francis Bacon's era, right? So Sir Francis Bacon was an English parliamentarian, was actually a parliament officer under the reign of Charles I, okay? Let me double check that. Charles I reign. I'm pretty confident I'm right about that. And I am. All right, so now look, big thing though, of Sir Francis Bacon, right? So Sir Francis Bacon was an officer in the English Parliament, right? He actually was a part of the House of Commons, and he is going to be one of the big guys that is actually able to continue scientific thought and recording scientific ideas following the banning of De Rev by the church. Because why? He's not Catholic. He's Anglican, right? Anglican and Puritan, all right? A little bit of Puritan, not a ton though. So what he begins to do is he begins to advocate for new ideas. And some of his groundbreaking works include a book he wrote called New Atlantis. And in New Atlantis, he began to kind of idealize the concept of science being for the greater good, right? He actually theorized like a Hogwarts-like building being constructed where scientists would do nothing but try to solve the modern-day problems of man. Men would come up to scientists with a problem. Scientists would then spend a ridiculous amount of time theorizing, hypothesizing, experimenting, observing the results, and solving these issues. What did we just invent? A lot of people attribute Sir Francis Bacon with the qualities of inventing the scientific method, right? He didn't actually invent the scientific method. He was just the very first person to write down scientific process, right? Of experimentation, hypothesizing, and observation, right? He is the first guy to kind of try and write down in New Atlantis, as well as another work called like the Treatise on Scientific Laws and Theories, where he actually begins to write down like what a scientific process should look like, how science should be used to solve the process of man, and actually also how science should be based more on observation, right? We should be observing the natural world around us and funding scientific efforts to grow our better perception of the life that exists, not only outside of our universe, but also the life here, right? The life here, the problems we can fix right now, not just what planet goes around what planet, but more along the lines also of how can science be used to help people, right? And so a lot of people typically give him credit for inventing the scientific method, all right? So, but again, that's not true. He did eventually lose his job as a parliamentarian, and he kind of spent the rest of his life expounding upon science and writing and things like that until his death. I think, when did he die? Sir Francis Bacon. I can tell you how he died, which is absolutely hilarious. So Sir Francis Bacon died in 16... So Francis Bacon actually died in 1626, and New Atlantis was actually posted after he had died by about a year, right? And so in 1626, he actually died performing a scientific experiment, right? He was traveling through the countryside, it was really cold out, it was snowing one evening, and he actually was looking outside of his carriage, and he looked out there and he looked at snow, and he's like, snow is ice. Wait a minute, I wonder if we could preserve things in snow during the wintertime. So he had the carriage pull over, and he hopped out of the carriage, and he ran over to a poor person's house where he bought from that person a chicken, right? So, and they slaughtered the chicken, they took all the feathers off the chicken, and he sat outside for over an hour stuffing the chicken with snow to see if it would preserve the meat from going bad versus a chicken that he had his control chicken probably to see if that other chicken would actually go bad before the other chicken, right? But what he forgot to do in this whole chicken v. chicken process is he forgot to put a jacket on. And he ended up getting a terrible case of pneumonia, which ended up killing him. So he forgot to put a jacket on when he was shoving snow inside of a chicken. All right. So, but Sir Francis Bacon, like I said, is going to be his on scientific works is going to begin to expound on these things. New Atlantis is another big one as well. But then you're going to see things roll forward. Okay. Now we're starting to see a continual rolling forward of ideas, right? And then you're going to see none other than René Descartes, cogito ergo sum, right? So René Descartes is going to have a very famous work known as the Discourse on Method, right? And in René Descartes' work, the question he's asking is much bigger, much more intense, much more aggressive. He is now taking scientific thought and he's blending it with philosophic thought, right? So René Descartes, being a part of the scientific revolution, is going to begin to theorize principles and ideas about how humans are interpreting the natural world. He takes Bacon's ideas and he takes them a step further, right? And he's doing all this in France because René Descartes is French. And when he's releasing these ideas, Louis XIV is like 9 years old, right? Just to give you an understanding of where we are in time. Louis is a little itty bitty baby, all right? So like little tiny guy, right? Little 9-year-old Louis is still like, doesn't even know. Like he almost is about to be killed during the Fronde rebellions. And the scientific revolution is rolling through during that time of absolutism, right? And René Descartes' biggest principal idea, his biggest discussion he wanted to ask is how do I know anything exists? How do I know that like I exist? How did I know that you exist? How do you know right now that this video that you're watching is not invented completely by your mind, right? How do you know that actually on your way to school today that you didn't almost get into a car accident and that you're sitting in a coma somewhere inventing all of this inside of your mind? Don't cry. All right, so like, don't freak out, it's okay, all right? So what did René Descartes begins to theorize, hypothesize, and try to understand is how can we prove existence? How can I prove I exist? How can I prove that any of this is real? And people will be like, well, why don't you pinch yourself? Your brain can invent all kinds of stuff, right? It can actually theorize emotions, feelings, and dreams and other alternate states, right? So how do we prove this, right? And so eventually, after racking his brain for months on end, living in his basement and just sitting there trying to figure it out, he comes and emerges out of his home with a thought and an idea that he writes down in this book called the Discourse on Method. And in that book, he determines cogito ergo sum, right? C-O-G-I-T-O, E-R-G-O, comma, S-U-M, right? Cogito ergo sum, which in Latin means I think, therefore I am, right? He theorized and hypothesized the idea that if I have rational thought, I can prove that I exist, right? Not necessarily can prove that you exist, but I can prove that I exist. I know I'm real because I have internal rational thought, right? I'm thinking of things. I am interpreting my mind. And also, this brought another big issue up to, as well. In his Discourse on Method, he now has to grapple with this other idea. Well, if your mind is creating this perception of the world around you, then how do you even necessarily know the link between the physical world and your non-physical mind? Which introduced this idea called the crisis of confidence, right? So in this book, he grapples with this crisis of confidence, trying to say, well, I can't really prove anything. But what I can prove is this idea of a dualist theory, right? He's like, my mind exists outside of the physical world. And he's not wrong. Your thought patterns, your ideas, your emotions, your thinking, your dreams do not exist on this physical plane, right? We, to this day, do not understand consciousness in a scientific manner. It is still, to this day, a natural phenomenon, not knowing what your consciousness is. The fact that, I'm thinking of a word right now. Thinking of a word. Can you guess what the word was? The word was football, right? So if you thought, first of all, if you thought that, that's really impressive. You creepy little, fortune teller mind readers, Alexis and Liana. I see y'all back there. Now, the big thing, though, is he's saying that exists outside of the physical world, right? This is the physical world, right? Things, objects colliding into one another actually existing on this plane. But my mind exists separate of that, right? It is detached from the world, but has the ability to understand the physical universe, right? Which interprets the idea of the rational mind of God. Now, he got a lot of blowback after this, right? Some people were arguing, it's like, are you trying to disprove God? Are you trying to say that your consciousness disproves God? Not really. Descartes was just kind of introducing more along the lines of an idea of God in his ideas of science being more like the guiding force rather than the sentient being, right? And this is going to lead to a lot of hubbub about his ideas, right? And this is going to lead to a lot of pushback and a lot of theorized people. People are going to say, oh, well, you're disproving God right now, right? And he's saying, no, I don't necessarily believe that because he remained a devout Catholic until the day of his death, right? So, or was he? Yeah, I think he was a Catholic. He remained a devout Christian until the day he died. And also, not limited to, but drop this down as well, Descartes also invented a lot of math stuff, all right? So, a lot of math stuff, for example, this bad boy right here is known as a Cartesian plane, right? So, Cartesian plane, he actually added to geometry and added to algebra using Cartesian figuring, and actually, he invented the graph that you actually plot your parabolas on, right? So, parabola. So, and the reason why is apparently he said that he was just sitting in his bed one night looking up at his ceiling, and a fly went zzz, and landed on the ceiling. It was zzz, and then landed on a different part of the ceiling, zzz, and landed on a different part. And he was like, if I drew lines, I could chart where that fly just landed. And he invented the Cartesian plane, right? So not only did he invent the Cartesian plane and did he cause massive strife within the religious community, he's also going to create a new rift within the philosophic community, right? This guy right here, this is Blaise Pascal, right? He actually entered into several debates with Descartes, and Pascal is very famous during the scientific revolution of inventing this thing known as Pascal's wager, right? Pascal's wager is the idea is well, we can't necessarily prove the existence of God, but we can definitely bank on it, right? So he's saying, I'm not wrong for believing that God is real, because if I am wrong, it's no skin off my back, right? So Pascal's wager becomes a very important thing, and René Descartes kind of leads into these different ideas, theories, these interesting dichotomies with the religious mind, right? And so because of Descartes using observational mind and observational theory, and because of Sir Francis Bacon, we're now seeing the adoption of what you would call the experimental method, right? Using observation, rationality, experimentation, and logic merged together, right? And the big thing that this is going to begin to create is scientific societies, right? So scientific societies funded by the state, okay? So you're starting to see the growth of scientific communities, okay? Louis XIV founds the Academy of Sciences in France. Let me look up what year that was. Academy of Sciences, France. In 1666, Louis founded the Academy of Sciences, but in 1660, England founded this one, and this is called the Royal Society of Science, right? The Royal Society, this is their coat of arms, and on that coat of arms says this phrase, nullius in verba, which means doubt everything, or take no one's word for it, right? So is what it means. And so these societies, these royal groups, these state-funded scientific communities start to produce some of the biggest minds that the world's ever seen. And one of them is this guy, Isaac Newton. I have no idea why I wrote this. I cannot remember to this day why this is here, but whatever, it is what it is. So no need to write that. But Isaac Newton is going to begin to make his headway and do a lot of his research later on following a lot of these guys. We know Descartes releases his ideas in 1637. We know Bacon releases his ideas after he's dead in 1627. But by 1640, the ideas of Galileo, Kepler, Brahe, and continuing forward with Copernicus as well are pretty universally accepted. All right, so because Galileo dies in 1642, I believe, death of Galileo. Galileo. Yes, 1642. Okay, so he dies in 1642. So by the time of 2 years before his death, Galileo, Kepler, and Brahe's ideas of the universe and heliocentrism are pretty universally accepted, right? Because science is beginning to roll forward, right? And interestingly enough, there's still one fundamental problem with it, right? You still don't understand why, right? So people are starting to say okay, fine. I get it. I get that, the sun's here, we're going around it, but why, right? A lot of people get into theorize but how? But why, why that? Why is it that we're not floating off into space? Why aren't we colliding with Mars? Why aren't we, knocking into stuff left and right? What keeps us on this track, right? How do these force ideas work, right? So that is where Isaac Newton comes in. Isaac Newton begins to bring in ideas about light and the forces of the physical universe, right? So with this, though, Isaac Newton begins to try and be the guy who links the sciences together, right? He comes in and he's like, well, I can try to figure out ways to do all of these different ideas. Why are the planets moving in this rotation? How do they stay on track? What prevents an object from moving? How is there a reaction to the movements of other options or objects? What happens to heat? What's all this stuff going on? So you have to understand, okay, that Isaac Newton is a titan in the scientific community, an absolute titan. And people used to tell him that. And he was like, oh, well, I have only seen so far because I have stood on the shoulders of giants, right? So, and I'm sure you've heard that phrase, I've only seen so far because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. Fun fact, Isaac Newton was actually making fun of somebody who was in the Royal Society with him. By the way, he was in the Royal Society. He was actually the lead scientist of the Royal Society in London during his time and during the 1670s. And literally he made this quote, I've only seen so far because I stood on the shoulders of giants, because him and this guy in the Royal Society hated each other. The other guy's name was Robert Hooke. Sure you've heard of Hooke. Hooke actually had a little bit of a hunchback and he was really short, so he was just making fun of him. All right, so now, because Isaac Newton was a jerk. Isaac Newton was not a nice guy. Some people believe in the modern era he may have actually had some type of mental incapabilities, we're not sure, but social stigmas did not work out with him well. He never got married. We believe that he probably died never having had a relationship with a woman whatsoever, right? So, and also it kind of created a very odd bird, right? An odd bird in a sense. But Isaac Newton became the royal scientist, right? Became the Royal Society scientist funded by the state. And he begins to beg a lot of questions. And this is not sitting there saying that when he was in his 20s, he was doing great work, right? Because he wasn't, okay? Because actually his first book that he ever released was a book called On the History of Fishes. It did not sell well. Nobody really cared. Apparently, he was giving them away as gifts by the time they were finished printing because nobody wanted to see his book about fish, right? So, but you have to understand as well, though, with this little weird guy that we have here, he's writing history of fishes. He's alive in London during the Great Plague. He actually moves out of town, but he's also super religious, right? Insanely religious. So he's a very interesting figure because he's holding on to the ideas of his faith, but he's grappling with the growth of science, right? He's kind of an interesting dichomatic figure because he's like being torn apart at the seams because he wants to believe in all the things the Bible says, but he's like right, and he's being pulled apart. A good example of this is like after he wrote The History of Fishes, he then produces a book called On Optics, right? And this is his studies of light and how light is actually, white light is the combination of all the colors of the spectrum, right? And in that book, he has to create a color spectrum, right? And so it's going to be Roy G. Biv, right? He goes red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Here's the problem. He added indigo on purpose, right? Because he didn't want to be stuck with 6 colors because he thought it was a number of the devil. Right? So he's a very interesting figure, right? But that is important to remember. He discovered that the white light is the combination of all light, right? So, but he added indigo because he doesn't want to be close to the devil. 6 is a bad number, according to him. He also, that's why he got so freaked out, that in 1665, the Great Plague happens. In 1666, the Great Fire of London happens. He thought the world was about to end, so it progressed his intelligence much faster, right? And so with that, during the time period of the Great Fire of London and also during the Great Plague, he had to move, right? He had to move out to the countryside so he could better work and also stay safe, to not get sick, and to also not have his house burned down from the Pudding Lane incident, right? So with this, though, while he's out there, he is on his parents' farm. And that farm has several apple trees, right? And the apple trees, one time he looked out his window and saw an apple fall, apparently. And it was at that moment that he begins to theorize the concepts behind the universal force of gravitation, right? So now everybody's like, oh, didn't he get hit in the head with the apple? Probably never even saw the apple fall, right? More than likely, he actually was doing some experiments with light, trying to understand optics better, looks out a window, sees something move, and he's like, oh, there's a force pulling everything back to the center of the planet, and this force has a universal force because Galileo figured out that all objects fall at the same speed, and so Galileo kind of set the physical tables for him to actually boost himself off of, right? And his Principia, he actually mathematically lays out gravitational pull of other objects, right? And he uses this gravitational pull and these theoretical ideas of gravitation to better explain what kept the planets on their tracks, right? So this guy comes in and he just links all of it together, right? It's Isaac Newton in the Principia, his biggest book, creates the laws on universal gravitation. Now, he also hated this guy, absolutely hated this guy, right? So this is his biggest rival. This is Gottfried Leibniz, because they actually had a competition also, because apparently Isaac Newton also claims that he invented calculus, right? But Leibniz said, I did it first, right? And we actually believe that Leibniz came up with calculus first, but that Isaac Newton probably just beat him to the punch and actually used calculus in his Principia, right? And if you find this stuff really, really interesting at any point, definitely ask me. I have a great book on this. It's called The Clockwork Universe by Edward Dolnick, and it is phenomenally interesting. All right, but we will talk about all these guys again a little bit tomorrow. I will see you guys then. Y'all have a good one.